So, hi, and welcome to episode number 2 of the VinConnect Wine Podcast, where the owners and winemakers of the world's top estates come to discuss the topics they're most passionate about. I'm your host, Kevin Sitters, VinConnect's founder and president. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Marc Hochar, the proprietor of Chateau Musar in Lebanon. As you may know, Chateau Musar produces an iconic set of wines that are known around the world for their unique blends of grape varieties, distinctive flavor profiles, and incredible ageability. As a result of decades of developing the market for their wines, they can be found throughout the U.S. at fine wine retailers, top restaurants, and of course, direct via their mailing list where you can sign up at vinconnect.com/wineries/Chateau Musar. Marc, a very warm welcome and thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here, actually.
So we're here to talk today about sort of wine and Lebanon. You know, people are certainly familiar with wines made from a variety of famous regions around the world: Bordeaux, Burgundy, Napa, Tuscany. But for many folks less knowledgeable about wine, I think they're often surprised to hear about wine made from Lebanon, and certainly world-class wine made from a place like Lebanon. So I thought it would be fantastic for people today to get the chance to learn more about the Bekaa Valley, where your wines are grown, and the unique attributes of the terroir there and the corresponding challenges you face in growing grapes and making fantastic wine from there. And then maybe we can then sort of build on that and talk about some of the more specific approaches unique to Chateau Musar in terms of farming and winemaking, and how what comes out of that is some of the world's most famous and distinctive and ageable wines. So I guess if that's the framework, maybe we could start with if you could give our audience a sense of the geography there in Lebanon, and specifically the Bekaa Valley, you know, what that maybe looks like from a geographical context, maybe sort of orient people, without a map handy, of sort of where we are in the world and what it looks like.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to start. So Lebanon, where's Lebanon? So we're on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. So we are south of Syria and north of Israel. So basically, between these two countries, it's a small country. It's rectangular with a coastline that's approximately 120 miles long, and on average 30 miles wide. Really 30 miles.
Okay.
That's it. That's really the average width of the country. And what's more important, apart from its small size, is the fact that it's really covered by mountains everywhere. So we're talking about
wow.
two chains of mountains that run north to south. One is in the center of the country, again, north to south. And another one is at the east border with Syria. And these two mountains go up to almost 10,000 feet.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you got sort of two parallel mountains and a valley in between.
And a valley in between, exactly. And the valley is called the Bekaa Valley. So this is where we grow most of our wines. The Bekaa Valley itself, the floor of the Bekaa Valley is at 3,000 feet. So when you are in the Bekaa Valley, you're watching either south or north, you have to your east one chain of mountains going up 6,000 feet higher that protects you from the desert that is in Syria. And then you have another chain of mountain to your west, which is actually also 6,000 feet higher than the valley. And that one protects you from the sea, from the Mediterranean, and from all the humidity that comes from there. So you end up with a microclimate that is very unique, I think, in a sense that because of its high altitude, you have actually snow in the winter. So you have a good amount of rainfall. People don't think of Lebanon as a country where you ski, but you actually have skiing, and our vineyards are covered by snow. Depending on the years, it can be anyway from a week to 2-3 weeks, depending on storms. Usually, if it gets really cold, it snows, but in the winter, the sun comes out and then gets warm again fairly quickly.
Sure.
But what this does is that this microclimate leads to one particular thing which is extremely useful for us, which is that there's usually no rain at all between spring, let's say April, and
Hmm.
harvest time, which is in September and
Wow.
October. So that's really 6 months or more without rainfall at all and without humidity. And you know, no humidity is a good thing to have when you're talking about trying to grow organic farms and organic vineyards, because it avoids a lot of the pests that you would
Sure.
usually have in other areas of the world. And the land of milk and honey. That's what the Bible referred to when they were talking about the mountains of Lebanon where wines were made, and that's because of the special terroir that we have.
And the history of grape growing goes back centuries and centuries and centuries there, does it not?
Yeah, yeah. So we've had wines for approximately 6,000 years in Lebanon. I mean, these are the oldest vats that have been discovered in the area. Um, but there is another study that's been done recently that talks not about vats and discovery of winemaking facilities, but also
Hmm.
of domesticated vines, as in
Oh,
vines
interesting.
that were used and planted for agricultural purposes, meaning that the people living there were not nomads anymore, and
Hmm.
and it started 11,000 years ago. And so
Wow.
to be honest, I doubt it took 5,000 years for, I guess, people to figure out that you could actually make wine from grapes. So if they started planting grapes at one point, they would have figured out also how to make wine. And I think it would have been probably earlier than 6,000 years ago. So anywhere between 11 and 6,000 years ago is when probably wine started in the area.
And so what else is grown there in terms of crops? Is it largely grapes? Is it like driving in Burgundy or Piemonte where it's sort of blankets of vineyards, or is it a whole bunch of different things? Some of which are grapes. I'm sure that's evolved over time as well.
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. Well, the Bekaa Valley is the breadbasket of Lebanon, in a sense that
Okay.
this is where most of the vegetables and the fruits are grown. It's not the only area, because also you do have on the actual mountain sides, you have terraces, and you have a lot of plantings that are actually done on terraces historically, that have been since the Phoenicians. Um,
Hmm.
but the Bekaa Valley floor in itself, it has a river that runs in the middle of it, so that adds a bit of water. It's actually a
Sure.
limestone floor with a layer of clay on top. And so the
Hmm.
closer you are to that middle part of the valley, and the more water you have, obviously. And
Hmm.
so this is where you see every type of fruits and vegetables that are planted. So Lebanon really is a seasonal fruit producing area. So when you
Yep.
live in Lebanon, your fruits and your vegetables really depend on the season,
Hmm.
and you have a variety and a diversity that's absolutely humongous. So everything will grow actually in the Bekaa Valley, and you will have also obviously grapes in the same way as all of the other fruits and vegetables tend to
Sure.
be, in my opinion, extremely how would I call it, intense in flavor. When you eat a carrot that's grown in the Bekaa Valley, it's just extremely intense in flavor of carrots. Same thing for
Hmm. Hmm.
watermelon. Everything grows well there, and same for the grapes. And I guess this is probably why the land was called the land of milk and honey. I don't
Sure.
think it refers to milk actually and honey, but I think it's more allegories, as in
Sure.
milk representing nourishment, the land that gives, in terms of agriculture, and honey representing more sweetness in terms of the sweetness of life rather than actual bees making honey necessarily.
Sure. So how are there areas that are more sort of all grapes as opposed to other fruits, or are the vineyards sort of interspersed with other crops and things? I'm just curious, trying to sort of mental picture it and compare to other regions in that context.
I think so. If you really the center of the Bekaa Valley, both from east and west, also from north to south. Well, the river runs mostly north to south in the center, and
Hmm.
as you get closer to the river, you have less and less vines. As you go more between the river and you go westwards, this is the main area uh, in the center of the country, roughly where you've had most of the vineyards. But again, it's a generalization, and you could
Hmm.
really drive and see at one point, let's say, between the villages of Ana, Ami, and in that area, for example, you'll find a lot of vineyards. And then, drive another 5 minutes, and then you'll see other types of crops that are grown
Interesting. Okay.
not too far. So it's not really just a vineyard area. It's really
Hmm.
mixed. Um, and other parts of
And
the
ha-
Bekaa Valley are also a bit drier. And so if you go more to the east, you tend to have less grapes than on the west side.
Interesting.
Um,
Hmm.
it changes quite a bit within the Bekaa itself.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's fascinating. And how has the sort of the volume of grape growing evolved over time there? Is it in many parts of the U.S., places like where I live in Virginia and Texas and other states, it feels like it's sort of growing all the time in terms of more land being planted to grapes, more winemaking, and those sorts of things. Has the Bekaa Valley evolved that way as well? Other crops get converted over to grapes and more winemaking, or has that been reasonably stable? I'm just curious.
It's a good question. I think, well, there's been a growth of winemaking, that's for sure. I mean, there were
Yeah.
20 years ago, there were 10 wineries. Now there are around 50. I think the new
Wow. Okay,
additions,
that's fantastic.
so it's a big growth in terms of number of wineries, but the newer ones have tended to be smaller, so it doesn't necessarily change dramatically the amount of grapes that have been planted, but it does mean
Hmm.
that there has been a growth in grapes, that's for sure. Um, but Yeah, it's a good question as to how much land has been used. There's a lot of space that is still available potentially for
Hmm.
planting. It's just that it's complicated in Lebanon because a lot of the land tends to be owned maybe by families or successions of many people, not all of
Hmm.
them living in Lebanon, and so it tends to be difficult to find these people to try to agree. Can we buy? Can we
Yeah.
rent? And then are they going to plant? Or in many cases, none of that is possible, and so you end up with land that stays, unused
Hmm.
for a while. So these are more structural issues, not linked to the land itself, but more to the ownership of the land and how
Yeah.
we can manage to get a hold of those to work them, either us or
Fascinating.
other producers as well. I think it's the
Sure.
same
Sure.
problem across the board, unfortunately.
So you talked a little bit about the soil and sort of the geology, but I'm curious if you might amplify on that a little bit in terms of comparing and contrasting that with maybe the soil or the geology in other famous wine regions, and then what the implications of that are on the varieties that grow best there.
Yeah, we are very much south as a country, and so if you actually draw a line and you go westwards, you reach Morocco.
Oh
So
wow.
what it
Okay.
means is that we are much more south than France, than Italy, than Sicily, than Spain, and
Hmm.
so that it means that you will get a lot of heat in Lebanon. What saves us in our case, in terms of allowing us to create wines that are elegant with, high sugar content, or not, well, high enough but not too high, as in enough ripeness but not too much of a high sugar and therefore alcohol content, is that we have this
Hmm.
altitude, and it's the altitude
Right.
of roughly 1,000 meters, or 3,000 feet approximately, that helps us avoid that. It means that you get a good difference in temperature between night and day. Usually it's between 5 and 6 or maybe 7 degrees Celsius difference between
Oh
night and
wow.
day during the summer. It's not a lot, but it's enough. It's enough really
Hmm.
to have the grapes ripen during the day and then rest at night before they start, they're ripening again the following day. And that amount of rest with a slightly lower temperature at night allows us to actually keep some acidity. so your
Mhm.
vines don't, completely get exhausted from the heat during the summer days. Um, that's usually what helps us a lot. In terms of differences compared to other regions, it would be difficult to know completely. I think that some other areas, if you look at the US and Napa, I think there's a lot of influence in some regions that comes from the sea,
Mhm.
um, either wind as well. And actually, we have none of those because of
Despite
it.
your proximity with the mountains, it just doesn't. It's just not an influence. It sounds like.
It's not an influence really because the mountains are so high, especially the ones the one to the on the west, which protects us from the sea. In the summer, actually, if you are in Beirut, you see the clouds starting to accumulate, but they never reach above the mountaintop, so
Oh, interesting.
they never cross into the valley, so you never get fog, for example, in the valley. That's
Hmm.
really not something that we get. And even though we are talking about a valley between two chains of mountains, in the summer there's almost no wind, so you don't get
Oh,
the effect
fascinating.
of wind, you don't get the effect of humidity. Um, the only thing you get is that well, you get heat waves, and it's the heat waves,
Yeah.
and it's the heat waves that actually hit us from time to time, and that really make it difficult for us uh, to well have a continuous and even ripening process. We can get hit
Well,
by heat
and
waves.
I would assume that the a tremendous amount of sunshine as well, and managing that along with the heat in terms of canopy and things are would be some of the things that you're having to deal
Yeah,
with typically.
to deal with. Yeah, so for example, we so in the case of Musar, we have organic vineyards, and what we do is we actually have no irrigation at all of our vineyards.
Mm.
So we're talking bush vines, and they're planted
Yep.
fairly wide, so 2 meters by 1 meter,
Oh wow.
because we need the vines to be able to survive on their own. There's enough
Hmm.
water in the aquifers because of all the rain and the snow that we get during the winter, but as soon as summer hits, or spring and then summer, you want your vines to really struggle a bit on their own to get enough water. And if they're
Hmm.
planted too tightly, then some vines will survive and some won't because there
Sure.
won't be enough water to share for all of that. So although we're talking about approximately 200 hectares of vineyards, actually our production is low compared to the size of the vineyards.
Oh,
We
just
are
because of
only
the
at
density of the planting.
the density of the planting, the fact that we also don't irrigate, all of that means that we're
Hmm.
at
Hmm.
roughly 25 hectoliters per hectare. Um, and that's, I would say, between 30 and 40% of a normal production. If you're planting with irrigation and
Right.
with trellises, and so it's a lot of land. But what it does is it tends to concentrate flavors. Uh,
Mhm.
Concentrate, as in it gives you a higher intensity in your flavors.
So how has I mean you mentioned your approach to farming is largely organic, but maybe you could amplify on that a little more, explain sort of what that means in your context and how perhaps that's evolved over time or not in the case of Chateau Musar.
Yeah. So when my grandfather started, he asked farmers to plant because he didn't have any land. He started really with nothing. And so at the time, the farming was done probably, you know, in the most natural way, positive, because we're not
Mm-hmm.
talking at the time, we're talking 30s and 1930s of a lot of pesticides being used or anything like that, as far as I know. Um,
Mm-hmm.
then, as we went through on with a few decades, uh, again, we were still buying grapes from these farmers. Some started to change maybe a little bit the way they planted. Maybe there was a little bit more of management in the vineyard that was done. And then as we reached closer to the end of the 90, so before the years 2000, we started really looking at having organic vineyards. We got our
Hmm.
certification in the early 2000s for the vineyards that we manage ourselves. And for us, it was important because we realized, although our whole process was based on a pure, non-interventionist approach at the winery and also in the vineyard, we realized that
Hmm.
some farmers were not necessarily doing exactly what we wanted, and so this is where we
Hmm.
started taking even more control of the vineyards, and the difference in flavor was relatively noticeable. In particular, even when you received your fruit at the beginning, without even talking about the wine stage, just about the fruit juice
Hmm.
stage, um, you can feel a difference in intensity and flavor, both linked to the organic vineyards and also to the density of your plantings. And
Sure.
obviously, these two factors really made a difference. And this is why we've always been pushing towards that organic farming approach, because we taste the difference. There's no
And
way around it. You taste the difference.
I'm curious. Is it demonstrable as well in some of the more analytical metrics? Whether that's sort of pH or sugars or dry extract or some of the other things that get measured in the lab.
That's a very good question, and one that I cannot answer, since I'm not the winemaker. And although we look at some of the numbers together, um,
Sure.
but it's really not a question I could answer. That's more a question actually that our winemaker Tarek.
But it's simple enough that you can taste it and it's evident.
In terms of tasting, absolutely, absolutely.
Sure.
As soon as you receive the grapes and you crush them and you start to have the first juice within the first day, I remember when we used to taste them, many a few decades ago. There was a very noticeable difference between whatever came that was
Mm,
organic or that was not. Uh,
right.
and so that's been our trend. Now, the advantage of Lebanon is that you can be organic almost by default. And I say
Mm,
almost because obviously you still need to control it and to decide to do it that way. Um,
sure.
but because we have no humidity or relatively low humidity, it really helps us to get there.
So do you go all the way to sort of full biodynamic or not, or how have you thought about sort of extending beyond organic potentially?
It's a good question. We discussed it a little bit, but it's been very difficult for us to implement. Um,
Mm,
there are a few reasons, and one particular reason is just the extreme weather conditions, the heat
sure.
waves. Um, because the issue in Lebanon, for example, I'll take a very simple example: Viognier Vermentino Chardonnay, that we use for our Musar Jeune, our entry level
Hmm.
Jeune white wine. Um, we usually harvest first week of August.
Wow.
We've had years where, let's say, we could not harvest as quickly as possible for the whole area, and where we harvested 1 week later after our sugar levels continued to grow up. And we went from
Hmm.
13 and a half alcohol levels to 15 in a week. And
Wow.
uh, that's extremely fast. And that is very difficult to do if you have to wait for the cycle of the moon.
Oh, fascinating.
The
Sure.
yeah. If you have to wait another 3 days, for us, it starts to be an issue. If you had to wait for another 2 weeks because it's just not the right cycle for the biodynamic calendar, then you might not have any juice left.
Right.
That's really well, it would be an issue for us. Now, obviously, these whites that were varietals that we imported are probably more susceptible to heat.
Hmm.
Um, Reds as well, because we imported a lot of the reds. We use Cabernet, that's very susceptible to heat. Um, Carignan and Cinsault are probably less susceptible to heat, but still,
Right.
if they need to wait 2 or 2.5 weeks, then your sugar levels go through the roof. The elegance
Right.
of your wines, you lose some of the balance, you lose some of the acidity. I think the only grapes that really don't care too much about the weather patterns and the heat waves are the two local grapes that we use for our Chateau Musar white, which are Obeid
Hmm.
and Merwah, because we get a heat wave and we have to harvest super quickly the Viognier. We have the same for the reds, and then we wait until October anyway to harvest our Baden Merlot. And they don't care. And this is the beauty of having, I guess, local varietals, is that they are
Yeah.
adapted to everything that happens in that land. And so for these, I would say, yeah, we could potentially go biodynamic because we would
Mm.
be less affected by the cycles and the timing of harvest. Um, but for all the other varietals that we use, which represent probably 95%, more than 95% of what we harvest,
Yeah.
it's impossible to do. So we focus on the organic side. I think that's really tastable,
Mhm.
in the fruit, and that's it. And we don't go the further than that.
It's interesting that you say that. I hadn't thought about the potential opportunities for some of those native varieties to become more attractive to people in other regions in light of what we've been dealing with in terms of climate change. I don't know if you've seen an uptick in interest in people wanting to potentially migrate some of their crops or test out planting some of those native varieties in
And
other terroirs where as things get warmer and CO2 keeps going up, they might actually fare better than some of the other stuff they currently have.
it's a good question. Actually, on my last U.S. tour, I had a gentleman who had land and wanted to plant some vines in Arizona. And he was asking
Mm.
me, so which varietals do you think we could use? And I told him, look, it's difficult for me to judge on the reds because, the temperature goes up to, I think, yeah, he was looking 42, 45 Celsius,
Oh
at
wow,
that,
yeah.
at that temperature in Lebanon, everything goes sour or downhill from there.
Hmm.
So it's difficult. Um, so I don't know how that would work in Arizona, and whether we talked about potentially Obeid and Marwah, but then it's difficult to export things from Lebanon in terms of plantings and things like that. But I
Sure.
mean, there are other varietals that are resistant to heat, that are local, and that are from the Mediterranean. I mean, so the first ones I thought about were also the Greek varietals. So an
Oh sure,
assertic, for
interesting.
example, I was in Greece a month ago, and some of the varietals that I was, tasting, the wines that I was tasting from some local varietals, also had similar characteristics as Obeid and Merwah in terms of late
Hmm.
harvest and alcohol levels actually staying quite low, even on reds.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I think when you take a local varietal from a very warm area, you're probably likely to be able to see it adapt in a very warm weather like Arizona. But it's still
Hmm.
going to be a challenge. It's still going to be a challenge, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and that brings to mind sort of another question. We've um, broadly in the wine industry been through a pretty big, at least in fine wine, a pretty big revolution toward sustainable or organic and sort of biodynamic, and a tremendous amount of investment and change in behavior as it relates to the farming aspects. And I think um, so many vintners of fine wines like there's just no question in their mind that it makes better wine, better tasting wine at the end of the day. And as someone who's been a part of this industry for decades now, I certainly feel like I could feel that both as an industry participant as well as a consumer. But I'm curious if we've sort of uh, had that acceleration or advancement, sort of industry wide, again, at least at the high end of the industry. Is there something you think that's next in terms of evolutions or revolutions in any part of sort of the winemaking process that have a similar opportunity to continue to push the ultimate level of quality or success forward, I guess, for the industry?
That's a tough question, Kevin. Um, Look, I mean, I think the challenge is everywhere the same in terms of the impact of heat. whether it's for vines and for, I guess, also even other vegetables and crops in general. I think you get huge volatility in productions of different types of vegetables across the world, depending on seasons, and it's getting worse and worse. Um, how does how do I see the future in terms of the vine part of the vineyard management? Um, Look, I mean, I guess probably the biggest example is what happened in Bordeaux, which started to allow some new varietals to be planted
Sure.
in the appellation, and that I think that change was made 4 or 5 years ago already. Does it mean necessarily that everybody will change as producers to these new varietals? Probably not. I don't know how many of the big chateaus have started using. I think it was, I don't know if it's between 5 and 10 that were added, and
Yeah.
how quickly they will adopt them. The issue with wine, and particularly with wines that age, like the wines we produce at Musar or the wines that are produced, let's say, in Bordeaux, is that, well, when you start planting, it takes you 3 to 5 years to start getting juice.
Sure.
Now, once you've had your juice, well, after 5 years, you're going to start making your wines. You make your wine the first year, then the second year, then the third year. How many times do you need to attempt and try something to start getting enough feedback from the product you've created to make an assessment? Is this the right thing
Sure.
to do? Is this the right decision? Am I treating the wines properly? Am I doing something that's wrong, or can I improve? And on top of that, if you really want your wines to age, you have to be able to taste the wines not after 2 years of production, but after 5 years or 10 years or 15 years.
Right.
So we're talking a cycle that's a generation,
Right.
between 5 years of planting and then making wines and then seeing what they give after 10 years. There you at least at 15 years of age. And
Right.
then you need to try it at least 5 times or 10 times to get it
Right.
right. So we're talking 25 years before you could really say, okay, this is the right thing to do here. Or, of course, you can do tests before, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's good enough, um, but maybe it's not the best. Also, in a sense that it can always be improved, or it could be improved. There's always a bit of luck. Huh? There's in winemaking, there's a gamble which is linked to weather.
Yeah.
But there's another gamble linked to life in the wine itself, and how it evolves, and
Sure.
how, if you don't treat it, and you're not really making wine in an industrial way, but rather in what I call a non-interventionist way, which is how we
Right.
do
Right.
it, then the vines can really evolve in so many different ways
Right.
that there's no control. And no control means that, well, you can get surprises.
Right. There's some risk. Right.
So
Well,
I guess that's the beauty about it. But this is that also shows how difficult it is as a process to get things right, or at least to improve things. But
sure.
a lot of great wines and winemakers in different regions have done things well. But historically, if you look at old Europe, because they've had a history of 100 years or hundreds of years before the
Sure.
appellation came in and said, okay, these are the varietals that you need to plant in
Right.
this area. It's based on history. It's not based on an assessment by a jury who said, okay, we'll plant this
Sure.
varietal in a particular area. So that took a lot of time. But you have the new regions of the world, the new world, where, yeah, there have been plantings which were in completely new areas that had never had wines or vines, and that made amazing wines. Are they necessarily the best? Yeah, gradually the information gets through, you start to analyze,
Right.
and then, yeah, you tweak it. Um, but it's really a difficult decision all along to see what is the best option. And also,
Right.
you as a winemaker, what do you like? If you don't like a particular varietal, even if it grows well in your backyard, yeah, maybe some will be happy to use it, but others will say, no, this is not what I want. This is not my style or
Right.
my taste, and then we'll go for something else.
Yeah, and I just think about that as it applies to some of the regions in the New World where grape growing is a more recent innovation. For example, where I am in Virginia, they're still figuring it out, and every 10 or 15 years, a new variety comes along, and That seems to be the thing that everyone's convinced, makes really great wine and will be the thing that takes over. And it ends up not sticking. And sure enough, down the road something else pops up as well. So yeah, without the benefit of hundreds or thousands of years of history and knowledge, despite areas with a lot of interest and growth in wine, they're still very much trying to figure it out.
There's still a lot to learn, and to be honest, there's a lot of in the same way as when you gamble, in terms of deciding what you plant and how you make your wines. There's a bit of luck. In gambling, there's always a bit of luck, and then maybe you hit the jackpot in a sense of finding, based on characteristics of different varietals and the terroir and the land and the soil and the sun and the temperature, etc. Maybe
Sure.
there's the magic formula that you figure out between reading, I guess, between the lines in the books about different varietals, and figure out the right one, and you test it and it works. And maybe then that's a good thing to happen, but it's going to be more maybe the exception, or it's
Yeah.
going to be a smaller number of cases than the general case. That's for
Right.
sure. That's at least my opinion on this.
Well, the last question that comes to mind for me, and this is going to be a little bit fuzzy, but you know, Chateau Musar's wines are renowned for being some of the most individualistic, distinctive, unique expressions of any major, famous, highly regarded wine. I would say, and that's sort of a consensus opinion, and it's certainly consistent with my personal experience. And obviously, you as much time as you spend in front of customers, marketing and sharing your wines and dinners and those kinds of things, you get to see that reaction from folks all the time, I would think. And I guess the question that comes out of that, we've covered a lot. We've talked about the unique terroir, where your vineyards are, some of the unique varieties that you guys have, your approach to farming and winemaking. But how would you put your finger on or explain or express, maybe to the extent you can, what makes
Basically,
Chateau Musar wines? Because I would argue in a blind tasting or in just about any setting, they express their Musarness. Even though they're individual and different across vintages, across different growing seasons, across different sets of weather and what have you, they carry an essence of Musarness, if I can say that. And I'm just curious how you
yeah.
think about that and what you might attribute that to the extent you can.
Yeah, I think you have. It's a tough question because it covers two things. First is what is the Musarness? What is the distinctive nature of Musar? And then what would explain it?
Mm,
On the first part, what makes Musar Musar? Um, it's true. Every vintage is different. Because we have a blend. Let's say in the reds, we have a blend of Cabernet Saint-Sauvignon. But then every year you could have one varietal that develops or ripens better than the other one. So therefore, it tweaks the vintage towards that varietal versus the others. Um, and it's because a third of these three. If it was
mm-hmm.
80% and then 10-10, it probably would
Sure,
not have made a big difference. I think the fact that it's a third does make a difference, and you end up with very different vintages because of that.
sure.
But what is the common denominator? The signature that's along that. I, it's difficult. I think one of the things is maybe that our wines tend to jump out of the glass. Uh, it's There's a little bit of VA in our wines. Our wines are not technically perfect, to be honest, and this is not what we
Mm,
look for. But we look for wines that have a certain life to them. Life as in ability to age, ability to change in the glass, ability to evolve, and rather than make it a static wine that you taste and you go back to your glass and you're tasting the same thing, our wines have this ability to change, and so every bottle will be a journey of 2, 3, 4 hours.
mm-hmm.
Now, can you spot that immediately, that Musarness, in a single smell or taste of the wines? Probably not. To get this Musar essence, you need this evolution. You need to understand that this this
Sure.
life that goes within the wines. And I think that's probably one of the features that's maybe a bit more characteristic. Um,
Hmm.
Now, this is maybe my small attempt at describing what is Musarness, although it's a very difficult one. Um, and as to why, then it's a combination, and a combination of a thousand things.
Hmm.
It could be definitely terroir, definitely varietals that we use, definitely winemaking approach, as in no intervention, no additives of yeasts, no fining, no filtering, no treatment, no nothing to
Hmm.
our wines, so that they remain alive, so that they have this ability to protect themselves, and because we haven't stripped them or added anything to them that changes the nature of the wine. I think this is the philosophy behind what we do.
Sure.
Um, and I think that this definitely gives a push and a help towards making the wines more ageable. Is it the only thing? No. We transport our grapes from the Bekaa Valley to the winery, and it takes a 3-hour truck drive in the sun, where the grapes are, almost, baking under the sun or burnt under the sun. Would you normally do that as a winemaker in any other area of the world? If you do this at an exam in enology, you probably will not get your exam.
Right.
But this is how we do it at Musar, and it works. It works as in, it's very difficult to determine, again, what is the exact thing that creates this
Sure.
ability to age. Um, it's a combination of a thousand things, and this is where I wouldn't say the luck component, but the circumstances component
Hmm.
makes or creates that. It's the fact that this is how we've been doing things, not necessarily on purpose. My grandfather did not decide to put the winery in Razia far from the vineyards because he wanted to.
Right.
It's because, well, he thought it would be a safer place to put it. He had the ability to use an old castle owned by his cousin at the time. So the opportunity set just created itself, and this is how
Hmm.
things went about. And it could have been a bad choice, to be honest. And but the idea of us as winemakers is that we take a set of circumstances and we try to make the best wine possible out of
Right.
it. Um, and to be honest, today, even if we were to change a small thing, like, for example, moving the winery 100 meters away and rebuilding a new winery, let's say because we want to grow, and doing otherwise all the rest the same, we probably will not end up with the same wines, because
Right.
ambient yeasts that participate to the fermentation, although a lot of these yeasts come from the skin of the grape
Sure.
themselves. It
Hmm.
could be also the ambient air. What allows the wines to develop, and their aging ability before we bottle them. All of that. So, a zillion amount of small components get into what ends up in the bottle, and we control very few of these zillions of components, and
Sure.
that's the beauty about life, and this is why we end up with, I think, a living product rather than a standardized commoditized product.
Well, I tell you, the wines are fantastic from an absolute level of quality standpoint, and as I said, really, really distinctive. They don't really taste like anybody else's wines. They always taste like Musar wines. And for folks who haven't had the opportunity to taste them, I couldn't encourage it more. And for folks who have had the opportunity, that's why you have such a big following of fans and admirers and people who always have on hand some Musar wines to share in special occasions and when they're looking for sort of just the right thing. So, well, look, we spent a lot of time chatting. I think we should wrap it up here. It's a good spot to end. Thank you, Marc, for joining me and for sharing a bunch of great information on Chateau Musar and your farming and organic practices. People can find you on the website at Chateau Musar. I think you're on all the major social platforms, right? Instagram, Facebook, places like that.
Exactly, exactly.
And I know you're in the U.S. frequently. I think you were just recently here. So typically, I would encourage people to be on the lookout for chances to run into you. But do you have future trip plans where where people might find you on the road and get a chance to interact in person?
Yeah, I usually come to the US twice a year, so it's October and April for 2 weeks at a time. To be honest, the schedule of October, although the dates are set, the exact schedule itself is not known. We're still working on completing that schedule. So hopefully we'll know. Yeah, it's going to be probably after the summer that I'll know exactly where. But then
Well, if
I'll connect with you, and then we'll try to share that information where possible with some of the Van Connect subscribers.
we would be happy to get that out to your mailing list. Well, look, thanks again for all the time for the great conversation. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast, and we look forward to catching up in person sometime soon.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kevin. It was a pleasure to
All
have
right.
that conversation with you. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Cheers. We'll talk again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.